The railroad agent's pen stopped moving when I told him my husband was dead. I'd practiced this moment for 3 weeks, counted the money 11 times, enough for the land and 6 months of building costs, mapped the property boundaries in my room until I could draw them from memory, researched the Homestead Act at the town library, copying passages in my neatest hand. I'd even dressed in my most respectable widow's black, the one with the high collar that made my neck itch but signaled propriety. I'd anticipated everything except the way anticipation doesn't soften impact. Mr. Hutchins, railroad land agent, 40-some years old, mustache waxed to aggressive points, looked up from my application with the expression men reserve for women who've forgotten their place. The office smelled of old paper and tobacco. Behind him, through the dusty window, I could see the plot I wanted, corner lot, good drainage, perfect for a boarding house, close enough to the depot for travelers, far enough from the saloons for respectability. I could see it. I could afford it. I just couldn't touch it. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, and the way he emphasized the Mrs. made it sound like a limitation rather than a title. "We don't sell to single women. Railroad policy." My gloved hands rested flat on the counter. I'd learned to keep them still when I wanted to make fists. "The Homestead Act allows single women to claim federal land." "Federal land, yes." He smiled the way you smile at a child who's confused arithmetic with philosophy. "Our land has different rules." I'd prepared for this argument, had the citations ready, but something in his smile, the casual certainty that I didn't matter, made the words stick in my throat. Not because I didn't know them, because some part of me, the part that had absorbed 28 years of being told what women could and couldn't do, agreed with him. That was the voice I'd been fighting since Thomas died. The one that whispered I was incomplete, unfinished, a fraction waiting for a denominator that would never come. I silenced it the way I'd learned to silence everything else, through will. "I have the money," I said. "I have the legal right. I'm prepared to." "The answer is no, ma'am." He slid my application back across the counter. The other clerks had stopped their own work to listen, pens hovering over ledgers, witnesses to my humiliation. "I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that preparation didn't matter when the rules were designed to exclude you. I understood that citing law was pointless when men could simply invent their own policies. I understood that standing here arguing would only make the spectacle worse. So I did what I'd learned to do in the 2 years since I'd become a widow. I counted my money back into my reticule, noted everything for potential future use, and left without crying. Outside, the November wind cut through my coat. Colorado cold has a quality of malice to it, like it's punishing you for the audacity of being warm-blooded. I stood on the wooden sidewalk and looked back through the window. Hutchins had already returned to his paperwork. I was dismissed, forgotten. Beyond his desk, I could see my land. The empty corner lot with its slight rise that would keep the foundation dry. Room for a 2-story building with a kitchen extension. A small garden plot behind. I'd measured it 3 times, calculating lumber costs and window placements and how many lodgers I'd need to break even. I could see every detail of the life I wanted to build. I just couldn't reach it. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of horse dung from the street. I pulled my shawl tighter and started walking back to my rented room above the milliner's shop. The room that held my entire life. A borrowed bed, a small stove, 1 trunk of clothes. Everything temporary, everything waiting. I'd been waiting for 2 years. Waiting to stop being a widow and become a person again. Waiting to move from surviving to living. Waiting for the grief to lift enough that I could see past the next day. Now I had a plan. Money saved from taking in washing and mending, a specific piece of land. A business strategy that would work if I could just get started. But the railroad said no. And the railroad's no was louder than federal law. I looked back one more time, through the window. Hutchins laughed at something another clerk said. My rejected application probably already in the trash. Not yet, I thought. This isn't finished yet. I didn't know how I'd change his answer. I just knew I would. Because the alternative was another year in that borrowed room, washing other people's clothes, disappearing a little more each day into the background of other people's lives. I'd survived Thomas's death. I could survive this. The question was whether I wanted to just survive anymore. 3 days later, I was at the general store buying nails and paint for a project I'd already diminished in my mind. A storage shed instead of a boarding house, rented land instead of owned. When I heard the storekeeper telling the new lawyer about my failure. "That widow who thought she could buy railroad land," he said, laughing. "Mrs. Fletcher, can you imagine? A woman trying to purchase property without a husband. The nerve of some people." I stood behind the fabric bolts, my hands stilling on the calico I'd been examining. The humiliation of being discussed like town gossip made my neck hot under my collar, but I didn't leave. Some instinct kept me listening. "Why is that nerve?" The voice was unfamiliar, Eastern accent, educated. "Doesn't the Homestead Act allow single women to claim land?" "Sure, federal land, but the railroad's got its own rules." The storekeeper's tone suggested this was obvious, inarguable. Can't have women going around making business decisions. Who'd be liable if it failed? Who'd enforce contracts? The woman herself, I'd imagine, same as any male property owner. There was a pause. I risked a glance around the fabric display. The new lawyer, Benjamin something. I'd heard his name but hadn't paid attention. Stood at the counter with the notebook open. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, wearing an Eastern suit that was too formal for Colorado. Ink stains on his fingers, the kind of earnestness in his face that suggested he hadn't been ground down yet. "Is their policy legal?" he asked. The storekeeper shrugged. "Legal enough if no one challenges it." "But is it actually legal? Under federal statute?" "Don't know. Don't care. That's how it's done." I should have stayed hidden, should have bought my nails and left. But something about his questions, the genuine curiosity, the lack of mockery, made me step into view. He noticed me immediately. "Mrs. Fletcher?" My walls went up automatically. Men who offered help always expected payment, and I knew what currency they usually preferred. "Mr. Hayes, Benjamin Hayes. I'm the new attorney." He closed his notebook. "I overheard about your situation with the railroad. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" I mind men discussing my private business as public entertainment. I kept my voice level, but something sharp edged into it. "That's fair." He didn't look embarrassed, just thoughtful. "Would you prefer to discuss it somewhere private? My office, perhaps, with the door open for propriety?" Every instinct screamed caution. I'd learned that men who seemed helpful often had angles. But his questions to the storekeeper had been technical, legal, not personal, not predatory. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Did the railroad cite a specific statute when they refused you? Did you ask for their policy in writing? Did they reference their federal charter or state incorporation?" These were not the questions of a man looking for gossip or advantage. These were lawyer questions, technical, specific. "No statute, just railroad policy. I didn't think to ask for it in writing." I paused. "Why do you care?" "Because I'm curious whether they're actually within their rights, or whether they're simply counting on people not to challenge them." He pulled out a card, handed it to me. "I'm not promising anything. I'd just like to research the legal basis for their refusal, if you're willing to let me look into it." I took the card. Plain printing, Benjamin Hayes, attorney at law, an address 2 streets over. "And what would you want in return?" "Nothing yet. I'm new here. I need cases to build a practice. If I find something useful, we can discuss terms." He met my eyes directly. "I'm not interested in any payment beyond standard legal fees, Mrs. Fletcher, and only if I can actually help." I wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. Hope felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. "One meeting," I said, "to discuss what you find, nothing more. That's all I'm asking." I left with my nails and paint, his card tucked in my reticule. As I walked back to my room, I caught my reflection in the shop window. Widow's black, determined jaw, eyes that revealed nothing. Good. Let him work for credibility. Let him prove he meant what he said. I'd learned the hard way that people's words and their intentions rarely aligned, but I'd also learned that sometimes you had to risk trusting in order to move forward. The question was whether this was one of those times, or whether I was just desperate enough to mistake performance for principle. I'd find out soon enough. Benjamin Hayes arrived at my room exactly on time, carrying law books and papers, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd spent the 3 days since our conversation doing actual work. I'd prepared for this meeting the way I prepared for everything, thoroughly. Cleaned the room, brewed coffee, set out the one chair and the stool I used at my small table, positioned everything so he couldn't sit too close, so I could see the door. So I maintained control of the space. He noticed. I could see it in the way he chose the stool instead of the chair, giving me the better seat. The way he set his materials on the edge of the table rather than spreading out. Small gestures that said he understood he was in my territory.
"Thank you for meeting with me,"
he said.
"I found some interesting precedents."
Interesting how? He spread out 3 documents, pointing to marked passages.
The Railroad's Federal Charter from 1862.
Land sale regulations from the Department of Interior, and a case from Nebraska last year. I leaned forward, reading. The language was dense, legal, but certain phrases stood out. Shall not discriminate in the sale or transfer of said lands, and gender shall not be grounds for denial of property rights under federal land grant provisions. They can't legally refuse you, Benjamin said. Their policy violates their federal charter. The Nebraska case is almost identical. A widow denied land purchase by the Union Pacific. She won. My hands, resting on the table, began to shake. Not from excitement, from the effort of controlling excitement. I'd learned that hope was dangerous. It made you vulnerable. It gave people something to take away. So the railroad is breaking federal law, I said slowly. Yes, they're counting on people not knowing that, or not having the resources to challenge them. And you think we could challenge them? I think we could write to their headquarters, cite these precedents, and request they honor your purchase application. If they refuse, we escalate to the Department of Interior. He paused. But I need to be honest about the risks. They'll likely fight back, blacklist you with local businesses, make shipping and supply difficult. It could get ugly before it gets resolved. There it was, the cost. Nothing came free, especially not justice. I poured coffee, buying time to think. Steam rose between us, carrying the bitter smell that always reminded me of early mornings with Thomas. He'd liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, said it was the only way to wake up properly. I pushed the memory away. Thomas was gone. This was about my future, not our past. What would you charge? I asked. Nothing unless we win, then standard percentage of the claim value. He shifted on the stool. Mrs. Fletcher, I'm not trying to take advantage. I'm trying to build a practice based on principle. This case interests me because it's clear-cut legally, even if it's complicated politically. I studied him. The ink stains on his fingers suggested he'd been up late researching. The nervous energy meant he cared about the outcome. But I'd been wrong about men before. Thomas had seemed steady and reliable too, until a mining accident took him and left me with nothing but debts and condolences. But Thomas hadn't chosen to die. He hadn't lied or betrayed. He'd just been unlucky. The question was whether I believed Benjamin Hayes was genuinely principled, or just good at performing principles. If I agree to this, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. I'm not a charity case. I'm not a cause for you to feel good about. I'm a client, and I expect to be treated as an equal partner in strategy. I wouldn't want it any other way. And if this goes badly, if I get blacklisted or bankrupted, that's on me. I'm making the choice with eyes open. Understood. I looked at the documents spread on my table, at the passages that proved the railroad was wrong, at the possibility of getting what I'd earned. Accepting his help meant admitting I needed it, meant trusting my future to someone else's competence, meant making myself vulnerable again after 2 years of building walls. But refusing meant staying alone, staying stuck, watching that corner lot sit empty while I washed other people's laundry and grew old in borrowed rooms. All right, I said. Let's do it. But we draft the letters together. Your legal language, my strategic judgment. He smiled, genuine, relieved. Deal. We worked until the lamp oil ran low, crafting a letter that cited precedent and requested compliance without threatening litigation yet. His handwriting, my words. By the time he left, my room smelled like ink and his shaving soap. Unfamiliar masculine scents in my carefully controlled space. After he was gone, I sat at the table with the draft letter, reading it over. Somewhere in those legal phrases was my future. Either the beginning of something better or another humiliation to survive. I wasn't sure which scared me more. 2 weeks later, my rented room had transformed into something between a legal office and a military headquarters. Maps covered the walls, property boundaries, railroad land grants, town plat. Coffee stayed warm on the stove all day, documents organized into careful stacks, precedents, correspondence, notes on local power structures. Benjamin's coat hung on the back of the chair like it belonged there. We'd fallen into rhythms. He arrived mid-morning with new research or drafted arguments. I made coffee and reviewed his work with the same careful attention I'd once given to household accounts. We'd argue over phrasing, his tendency toward elaborate legal language versus my preference for clear, cutting brevity. Usually, we'd find compromise somewhere in the middle. What surprised me was how much I'd started to enjoy it, not just the work itself, though there was satisfaction in building a strong case, but the collaboration. The way he'd ask, "Which precedent do you think is strongest?" and actually wait for my answer. The way he'd explain complex constitutional theory without simplifying or condescending. The way he'd defer to my judgment on local strategy, which families held grudges, who owed whom, why timing mattered with the mayor's election coming up. He treated me like a colleague, like my mind mattered as much as my cause. I'd forgotten what that felt like. The key is making it more expensive for them to fight than to comply, as said, reviewing his latest draft. We need to make clear that we're prepared to escalate to the Department of Interior, which means federal oversight of their entire charter. That's their nightmare. Won't that make them more defensive? Yes, but defensiveness leads to mistakes, and we document every mistake. I tapped the growing file of correspondence. This isn't about one letter, it's about building an undeniable pattern. Benjamin made notes, nodding. You'd make a good lawyer. I'd make a good boarding house owner. Let's focus on making that possible. He laughed. It was a good sound, easy and genuine. The kind of laugh that made the small room feel less cramped. That's when I noticed how close we were sitting. When his sleeve brushed mine as he reached for papers. When the comfortable silence between us felt less like strategy and more like something else. I stood abruptly, refilling coffee neither of us needed. Grace? He'd started using my first name a week ago. I hadn't objected. Though I should have. Propriety demanded Mrs. Fletcher. But grace in his voice sounded different than it had in Thomas's. Not better or worse, just different. We should review the response timeline, I said, not turning around. They have 10 business days to reply to our second letter. That's not what I was going to ask. I kept my back to him, watching coffee drip into the pot. Then what? Do you ever take a break, go for a walk, do something that isn't work? I take breaks when I can afford them. Grace. There was something gentle in his tone that made my chest tight. You can't fight every battle without rest. I've been resting for 2 years, I said, sharper than I intended. Rest looks a lot like giving up from where I'm standing. I heard him stand, his footsteps on the bare floor. Then he was beside me, careful not to touch but close enough that I could smell ink and soap and something else I couldn't name. This isn't giving up, he said quietly. This is the opposite. Before I could respond, someone knocked. I stepped away quickly, grateful for the interruption. Benjamin moved back to the table, giving me space. When I opened the door, the postmaster stood there with a letter. Official railroad letterhead. Came on the afternoon train, he said, eyeing Benjamin with curiosity. Thought you'd want it right away. I took it with steady hands, thanked him, closed the door. Benjamin and I stared at the envelope. "Do you want me to open it?" he asked. "No, it's addressed to me." I broke the seal and read again, then handed it to Benjamin without speaking. "They're threatening to blacklist you," he said slowly. "And me. Any business dealing with either of us will face complications in shipping and supply." He looked up. "They're escalating. Because we're a real threat now." I should have felt scared. Instead, I felt oddly exhilarated. They wouldn't bother threatening if they weren't worried. "Grace, this could destroy your livelihood. Mine too." "Illegal is illegal," I said, "regardless of who it inconveniences." He blinked. "That's my line." "I know, I'm stealing it." I took the letter back, studying the signature. "This is from regional headquarters, not local. That's good. Means Hutchins escalated it up the chain. Means we're making them nervous." "You want to continue?" I looked around my room, at the maps and documents, at Benjamin's coat on the chair, at the work we'd built together over 2 weeks. Somewhere in those 2 weeks, I'd stopped thinking I and started thinking we. I wasn't sure when it happened, just that it had. "We continue," I said, "but more carefully. We document everything, and we prepare for the long fight." His smile was equal parts relief and respect. "Then let's get to work." We stayed late that night, drafting responses and planning contingencies. Around midnight, I made more coffee. Benjamin's jacket was still on the chair. My room smelled like ink and possibility. I didn't let myself examine too closely why that felt dangerous and right in equal measure. The second railroad letter arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days after the first threat. This one was worse. "They're threatening legal fees," Benjamin read aloud. "Claiming we're engaging in harassment. They've sent copies to local businesses warning them that dealing with either of us could result in shipping complications and supply disruptions." He set the letter down carefully, like it might explode. Outside my window, November wind rattled the glass. Inside, the lamp flickered. We'd been at this for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of research and letters and building a case that suddenly felt fragile as old paper. "Maybe I should stop," I said. The words came out before I'd fully thought them, but once spoken, they hung in the air with the weight of temptation. Benjamin didn't respond immediately. I watched him process, his fingers drumming on the table, a nervous habit I'd learned to recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "What do you think is right? Not, don't stop, or we can fight this. Just a question, one that assumed I had moral authority to answer it." The question undid me in ways argument never could. My hands, which had been steady through every confrontation, started shaking. I pressed them flat on the table, but it didn't help. The trembling moved up my arms, into my chest, until I had to stand and walk to the window just to have something to do with my body. "I think they're going to win," I said to the glass. "I think we're going to spend months fighting, and they'll have better lawyers and more money. And in the end, I'll be blacklisted and broke and still living in this damn room." That's not what I asked. It's the practical answer. "Grace." He stood, but didn't approach. "What do you think is right?" I closed my eyes. Behind them, I could see Thomas's face. Not the way he looked dead. I'd learned to push that image away. But the way he looked the morning he left for the mine. Kissing my forehead. Promising to be home by supper, making plans for the future we'd never have. He'd been 26. I'd been 26. We'd had 1 year of marriage and a lifetime of plans. The mine collapse took 17 hours to kill him. Long enough that they got some men out. Not him. I'd waited at the mine entrance with the other wives, watching names get called, watching women collapse with relief or grief. When they finally brought him up, I'd been relieved it was over, then immediately hated myself for being relieved. The lesson I'd learned: vulnerability kills. Caring too much leaves you exposed. The safer path is not to want anything too badly. I'd spent 2 years building walls, being competent, being careful, needing nothing and no one. Now I was risking those walls for a piece of land and a lawyer I barely knew. What if I'm not strong enough? I asked the window. What if we lose and I fall apart? Then you fall apart. Then you rebuild. I turned to look at him. Just like that? Nothing about this has been just like that. He moved closer, still careful not to touch. You've been fighting alone for 2 years. Maybe it's time to try fighting with someone. That's terrifying. I know. If I let myself want this too much, if I let myself depend on this working, and it fails, then we'll deal with that if it happens. I looked at him, really looked, at the ink stains on his fingers from late-night research, at the worn patches on his collar that suggested he wasn't wealthy, at the idealism in his face that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. He was risking his practice for this, his reputation, his future in this town. Why are you doing this? I asked. Because it's right. Because the law should protect people, not just power. Because... He paused. Because I think you're right to fight. And someone should stand with you. The armor I'd built, the competence, the self-reliance, the careful control, had one purpose: protecting me from caring about outcomes I couldn't control. But standing here, watching Benjamin wait for my decision, I understood something I'd been avoiding. Invulnerable meant alone. Safe meant small. I could stop now, build nothing, risk nothing, stay safe. Or I could choose to care. Choose to want something beyond survival. Choose to let someone see my fear instead of just my strength. We continue, I said. My voice shook, but I kept going. We document everything. We build the case carefully. And we prepare for the worst while hoping for better. Together? Together. I took a breath. Benjamin, I need you to know something. I'm terrified of this, of wanting it too much, of depending on you and having it fall apart. I know. How do you know? Because I'm terrified too, of letting you down, of being wrong, of not being good enough to win. We stood there in the lamplight, both afraid, both stubborn, both choosing to fight anyway. Then let's be afraid together, I said. He didn't touch my shaking hands, just nodded. I'll draft a response to their threat, something that shows we're not backing down, but that we're being measured and legal about it. I'll research which local businesses are least dependent on railroad shipping. We'll need allies. We worked until dawn, building contingencies and courage in equal measure. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I realized I'd made my choice not just about the land, but about something larger. I'd chosen to stop being alone, even if it meant being vulnerable, even if it meant risking the walls I'd built. The fear didn't go away, but for the first time since Thomas died, I felt like I was living instead of just surviving. That had to count for something. 6 weeks after my first attempt to buy land, Mr. Hutchins sent a note requesting I return to his office. I dressed in the same widow's black, carried the same documents, but I wasn't the same woman who'd stood at that counter 2 months ago. I'd learned legal precedent and political strategy. I'd built a case file 3 inches thick. I'd stopped fighting alone. Still, my hands were cold as I pushed open the railroad office door. Hutchins didn't make me wait. He called me to the counter immediately, his expression careful and blank. Mrs. Fletcher, the railroad has reviewed your application in light of the legal concerns you raised. He slid papers across the counter. We've decided to honor your purchase request. I stared at the documents, my name, the property description, the price I'd offered 2 months ago. You're selling me the land? The railroad wishes to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Given federal statutes regarding land grants, we feel this is the appropriate resolution. His jaw was tight. You'll need to sign here and here. My fingers felt numb as I picked up the pen. This was everything I'd wanted. The land, the legitimacy, the future I'd been fighting for. So why did it feel hollow? I signed. Hutchins countersigned. He handed me the deed with the expression of a man forced to eat something distasteful. "Thank you," I said automatically. He didn't respond. Outside, November's sun cut through cold air. Benjamin was waiting by the hitching post, trying to look casual and failing. When he saw my face, he lit up. "You got it?" I held up the deed. "I got it." He grabbed my hands, propriety be damned, and squeezed. "Grace, you did it." I should have been elated, triumphant. Instead, I felt the strange flatness that comes when you achieve something and realize it's not enough. The victory stopped at my doorstep. That's what made it feel incomplete. "Mrs. Fletcher." I turned. Sarah Brennan stood there, thin and nervous in a coat too light for the weather. The seamstress who worked from a rented corner of the milliner's shop. I knew her by sight, not friendship. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but I heard what you did. With the railroad, how you made them follow the law." I had help, a good lawyer. "I need help too." She twisted her hands together. "I applied for a business license last month to open my own seamstress shop. They denied me. Said unmarried women can't hold commercial licenses without a male guardian signature." Before I could respond, Mary Chen approached, the baker's daughter. I'd bought bread from her family for years. "Mrs. Fletcher, the bank denied my loan application. I want to open my own bakery. They said women can't borrow without a husband's signature, even with full collateral." Then Mrs. Halstead, the widow who lived 2 streets over. "My husband left everything to me in his will, but his brother is fighting it, saying widows can't inherit property fully without male oversight. The lawyer says that's just how things are done." 3 women, 3 different denials, 1 pattern. I looked at Benjamin. His expression mirrored what I was thinking. This was never about one plot of land. It was about a system designed to exclude. And we'd just proved that system could be challenged. "Come to my land tomorrow," I heard myself say. "Bring your paperwork. All of it." "You'll help us?" Sarah asked. I thought about stopping, about building my boarding house and disappearing into quiet respectability, about taking my victory and running, the safer choice, the one that wouldn't risk the hard-won ground I'd just gained. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unknown what I'd learned about fighting systems, couldn't forget that 2 months ago I'd been where they were, standing outside windows, looking in at lives I couldn't reach. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I know someone who does." I looked at Benjamin. He nodded. "Bring your documents," I said to the 3 women. "Tomorrow, we'll see what's legal and what's just policy pretending to be law." They thanked me and left. I stood there, holding my deed, feeling its weight increase with each name I'd just added to the fight. Benjamin touched my elbow gently. "You don't have to do this." "I know. The boarding house alone will be a full-time enterprise, adding 3 legal battles." "I know." "Then why?" I looked at the deed again, my name in official ink, proof I existed as a legal entity, that I mattered. Because 2 months ago, I stood in that office and Hutchins looked through me like I didn't exist. And the worst part wasn't his refusal, it was the part of me that agreed with him. I folded the deed carefully, put it in my reticule. If I walk away now, I'm saying their exclusion was wrong for me, but acceptable for others. I'm saying I got mine. So the pattern doesn't matter. I met his eyes. "I can't live with that, can you?" "No," he smiled. "But I wanted to make sure you'd thought it through. I've thought about nothing else since they left. And I'm terrified, and I'm going to do it anyway." We walked to my land, legally mine now, and stood looking at the empty lot. I could see the boarding house I'd planned. But now I saw something larger, a place where women could plan strategies instead of just serving meals, where legal precedent mattered more than male permission. "This is going to be harder than the railroad," Benjamin said. "I know. We're going to make enemies. We already have." He took my hand, properly improper, right there on the public street. Then let's build something worth the fight. I squeezed back, and for the first time since signing the deed, I felt the elation I'd been waiting for. Not because I'd won, but because I'd chosen to keep fighting. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my land alone. Dusk was settling in, turning the Colorado sky those particular shades of orange and purple that make you understand why people move west. The wind had died down. The air smelled of sage and dust and the promise of winter. This ground was legally mine, 40 feet by 60 feet of possibility, room for a 2-story building with a kitchen extension and small garden plot. I'd measured it so many times I could pace the boundaries with my eyes closed. I could start building next week if I wanted, hire a carpenter, order lumber, begin the boarding house I've been planning for 2 years. Instead, I'd agreed to help 3 women I barely knew fight battles that weren't mine. What was I thinking? I sat on a flat rock near the corner stake, watching darkness creep in. Around me, the town was lighting lamps, making supper, settling into evening routines, normal lives in normal homes. I'd wanted that. Normal. Mine. Safe. Now I'd chosen complicated. Shared. Risky. For the first time since Thomas died, I let myself really think about his death. Not just the grief. I'd processed that through 2 years of crying and not crying and learning to function anyway. But the lesson it had taught me. The morning he left for the mine, I'd been making breakfast. Eggs and bread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. He'd kissed my forehead, said, "Love you, Grace." Made a joke about bringing home extra pay because they were working a new seam. I'd said, "Be safe." He'd said, "Always am." 17 hours later, he was dead. The lesson was clear. Vulnerability kills. Caring too much about outcomes you can't control leaves you exposed. The safer path is needing nothing and no one. I'd built my whole life around that lesson. Became competent, self-sufficient. Invulnerable through careful planning and emotional distance. It had kept me alive. But alive isn't the same as living. Now I was choosing to care about 3 women's outcomes. To work with Benjamin in ways that had started feeling less like strategy and more like partnership. To build something permanent instead of temporary. To want things I couldn't guarantee. The fear sat heavy in my chest. What if I failed Sarah and Mary and Mrs. Halstead? What if my competence had been luck? What if extending myself broke something I couldn't rebuild? What if I fell in love with Benjamin and lost him the way I lost Thomas? That last thought came unbidden, and I immediately tried to push it away. But it stuck, because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, working late over law books and coffee, arguing about strategy and laughing at small victories, I'd started feeling things I'd sworn not to feel again. Not the same feelings I'd had for Thomas. Those had been young and certain and built on the assumption we'd have decades together. These feelings were more complicated, built on respect and shared purpose, and the way Benjamin looked at me like my mind mattered as much as my cause. Built on partnership, not rescue, which somehow made them more terrifying. I could stop now, build my boarding house alone, keep my heart safely locked away, protect myself from loss. Or I could choose connection, choose to care, choose to build something larger than my own safety. The land didn't care what I chose, it just waited, patient and empty. Above me, stars started appearing, one by one. The same stars that had been there the night Thomas died. The same stars that would be there long after I was gone. They didn't make the choice easier, but they reminded me that the choice mattered less to the universe than it did to me. Whatever I decided, the world would continue. The question was, what kind of life I wanted to live in it. A safe, small one, or a risky, meaningful one. I didn't decide that night, just sat with the fear as darkness came complete. Let myself feel the weight of other people's hope and my own vulnerability. Tomorrow, I'd have to choose. Tonight, I let myself be uncertain. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of wood smoke from town. Somewhere, People were safe in their homes, building fires, making plans. I wanted to be one of them, but I wanted it to mean something. The stars didn't answer, they never did. But sitting there in the dark, on my land, I started to understand that maybe the answer wasn't in the stars. Maybe it was in the choice itself. Not whether to be vulnerable, but whether to let vulnerability mean something. I'd decide in the morning. Tonight, I just sat with it. 3 months later. I stood in the main room of my half-built boarding house and realized I'd built something entirely different than I'd planned. The structure was there, walls framed, roof on, windows in. But the largest room, the one I'd designed as a dining area for lodgers, had transformed into something else entirely. Maps covered one wall, county boundaries, land grants, business districts. Another wall held documents, ordinances we were challenging, legal precedents, lists of discriminatory policies. The long table I'd planned for serving meals was covered with papers and coffee cups and the organized chaos of ongoing legal campaigns. Sarah Brennan sat at one end, reviewing business license applications with 2 other women who'd heard about our work and wanted help. Mary Chen was teaching Mrs. Halstead how to document denied credit applications. 3 more women I didn't know well were taking notes as Benjamin explained federal commerce law. I'd set out to build a boarding house. Somehow, I'd built a headquarters. Grace? Benjamin appeared at my elbow, 2 coffee cups in hand. You looked lost in thought. I took the cup. 3 months of working together had created shortcuts. He knew I liked my coffee with cream, knew when I needed thinking space, knew the difference between my strategic silence and my worried silence. Just wondering how we got here, I said. You invited 3 women to bring their paperwork. They brought friends. The friends brought friends. He smiled. You built something people needed. We built it. Fair point. Around us, the room hummed with purpose. Sarah was laughing at something, her thin frame less anxious than it had been in November. Mary's loan application had been approved after we'd threatened federal commerce violation charges. Mrs. Halstead had won her inheritance case last week. We'd changed 12 local ordinances, influenced 2 state policies, made the word precedent into a weapon women could use. And I was exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. Can we talk outside? Benjamin asked. I followed him to the patch of land that would someday be a garden. The January air was sharp and cold, but clear. You could see mountains from here on days like this. I have a proposal, he said. Another case? A different kind of proposal. He turned to face me fully. Grace, we've been doing this for 3 months, building cases, fighting systems, making enemies together. I'm aware. We're stronger together than apart, legally and practically. He took a breath. If we marry, I can't be compelled to testify against you if any of these cases get uglier. You'd have access to my legal credentials for filing documents. Our combined resources would be. Are you proposing marriage as a legal strategy? I tried to keep my voice neutral, but something in my chest was doing complicated things. I'm proposing marriage as a partnership. Legal strategy is part of it. He met my eyes. But I'd also like to build this life with you, the fighting and the rest of it. The rest of it. Such a small phrase for such a large thing. I looked at my boarding house, half finished but already alive with purpose. I looked at Benjamin, ink-stained and earnest in everything Thomas hadn't been, not better or worse, just different. Thomas and I had been young and certain. We'd assumed decades together. Benjamin and I were older and cautious. We knew loss, knew risk, knew that partnership didn't mean rescue or completion, it meant multiplication of strength. I need you to understand something, I said carefully. If I say yes, it's not because I need you to complete me or save me. It's because I choose to build something with you. I wouldn't want it any other way. And we keep fighting. This doesn't end with a wedding. The work continues. I'm counting on it. I thought about safety and risk, about building walls and tearing them down, about the difference between surviving and living. Yes, I said. Let's make it legal, and let's keep making everything else legal too. He kissed me then, not desperately, but deliberately. the kiss of two people choosing each other with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost. When we broke apart, I could see Sarah watching from the window, grinning. Within minutes, everyone would know. "They're going to talk," I said. "Let them talk. We've got work to do." We walked back inside together, to the maps and documents and women learning to use law as a weapon, to the boarding house that had become something larger than shelter, to the life we were choosing to build, imperfect and risky and entirely ours. 3 years later, I woke to the familiar sounds of my boarding house coming to life. Downstairs, the main room was already occupied, Sarah reviewing contracts with a new business owner, Mary teaching a class on bookkeeping, Mrs. Halstead mentoring a young widow through property inheritance law. The coffee was hot. The maps had expanded to cover 3 walls. In the study, Benjamin worked on a brief for a case in Denver. Our cases had grown beyond local ordinances now. State legislation, federal precedent. The work never stopped, just expanded. I made coffee in our kitchen, the extension I'd planned 3 years ago, finally completed. Through the window, I could see the garden where I'd said yes to partnership and permanence, where I'd chosen connection over safety. It had been the right choice, not easy, not simple, but right. The boarding house had paying lodgers now, women passing through, women starting over, women who needed temporary shelter while building permanent lives. But the main room remained headquarters. That had been my compromise, business and purpose under one roof. Benjamin appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day. He kissed my temple absently, poured coffee, reviewed notes. The comfortable routine of 3 years together. "Anna Martins is coming this morning," he said. "The loan application?" Bank denied her, said women can't borrow without a husband's signature. I smiled. "So she needs to learn federal commerce law." "She needs to learn she already has the tools. We just have to show her where they are." The knock came at 9 exactly. I opened the door to a young woman, maybe 23, carrying a folder of paperwork with the determined expression I'd seen in my own mirror 3 years ago. "Mrs. Hayes? I'm Anna Martins. The bank denied my loan to open a dressmaking shop. I heard you might help." I gestured her to the kitchen table, the same table where Benjamin and I had drafted our first letters. It was scarred now, ringed with coffee stains, marked by 3 years of work, history and wood grain. "Tell me what happened," I said, pouring coffee. As Anna explained, I took notes. Benjamin brought the relevant precedent files. We'd streamlined this over 3 years, knew exactly which statutes applied, which cases set precedent, which strategies worked. "Here's what you need to know," I said when she finished. "The bank's policy violates federal commerce law. We've established this precedent in 15 cases now. What they're doing is illegal. Can you fight them for me?" "No," I slid the precedent files across. "You're going to fight them. We're going to teach you how." I watched understanding dawn in her face, not rescue, empowerment. For the next 2 hours, I showed her what we'd learned. How to cite precedent, how to document denial, how to request policies in writing, how to build a case that made fighting more expensive than complying. Benjamin added legal specifics, I added strategic timing. Together, we gave her weapons. By the time Anna left, she had a folder of precedents, a draft letter, and the particular expression women get when they realize they have more power than they thought. After she was gone, I sat at the table with my coffee, looking at the documents we'd built over 3 years. The ordinances changed, the policies challenged, the women who'd learned to fight. 12 more next week, Benjamin said, reviewing the schedule. The work keeps growing. Good, he smiled. You're not tired of it? I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, standing at Hutchins' window, believing I didn't matter, building walls to stay safe, surviving instead of living. The work doesn't tire me, I said. It's the point. Through the window, I could see Sarah leaving for her shop, her own shop, legally licensed and thriving. Mary's bakery was visible down the street. Mrs. Halstead walked past with her granddaughter, heading to the school where she now taught young women business basics. The pattern we'd broken hadn't stayed broken. New obstacles appeared constantly, but now we had tools. And more importantly, we shared them. Benjamin pulled on his coat. I have to be in court at 10, the merchant licensing case. I'll review the Miller property inheritance this afternoon. She's coming at 3. He kissed me properly this time. See you tonight. After he left, I sat in the quiet kitchen. Outside, town sounds filtered in. Wagons, voices, the ordinary business of lives being lived. My life was ordinary too, in its way. Coffee and paperwork and ongoing fights. A husband I'd chosen deliberately. A house that served multiple purposes. Work that never ended. But ordinary felt like victory, because 3 years ago, I hadn't believed I deserved ordinary. Hadn't believed I deserved to matter. Now I knew better, and more importantly, I'd learned to share that knowledge. The next woman who walked into that railroad office wouldn't need a lawyer. She'd already know her rights. And if they tried to stop her, she'd know who to ask for help. Not rescue, just the tools we'd learned to share. I finished my coffee and pulled out the Miller inheritance file. The work continued. That was the point. Outside my window, the mountains stood clear against morning sky. The same mountains that had been there when I arrived. The same sky that had watched me transform from widow to property owner to teacher to partner. The stars would be there tonight too, indifferent and eternal. But down here, in this town, in this boarding house built on stubbornness and strategy, women were learning they mattered. That was worth every risk I'd taken. I opened the file and got to work.